the integration of the future force. I'm sorry that I wasn't here this morning. I got gazumped by the PM, so I apologise for that, because this is now a little bit out of sequence with how I wanted this to run. But I thought it was important to come and talk to you anyway. Those of you who were at the Williams Foundation conference earlier this year, you can nod off. It's okay, because it's basically it's the same message that I'm going to deliver, and I strongly believe that you should keep banging on about messages until you see evidence of someone listening to you. So it's not that I don't think people haven't been listening, but I'm going to keep pushing the message for a while. So I apologise if you've already heard most of this. Well, I don't really. And it's not because I haven't got the imagination to come up with a different speech. It's that I think this message is actually a pretty important one, or there are some pretty important messages in it. So you've hopefully already heard a bit of the detail about what we're doing in the force design space and the capability lifecycle more generally. I see that you had a little bit on contestability as well, which is good. We'll talk about that as we go through. I want to try and speak from the Joint Force Authority perspective, and just reinforce the fact that a lot of this is only possible due to the work that was done by the First Principles Review. In fact, I just came from a meeting with the Oversight Board, who were basically the review team, talking about where we're up to and what our ongoing challenges are. The review has really enabled us to focus a lot more time and effort onto the joint force. I've made the point several times publicly that as I was then in 2014, the Joint Capability Authority, the J and the C part of that were in uppercase, but the A part was a lowercase a. And the VCDF really didn't have the true authority that was needed to make binding and enforceable decisions around capability development in terms of the joint force, and particularly around C4ISREW decisions. We now have a capital A, which is good, and the First Principles Review really gave us that. I don't actually want to use it all that often. I didn't want to capitalise it because I wanted to run around issuing dictats every day, but I wanted to have the ability to enforce what we needed to do from a joint force perspective when we needed it. And I would say people have embraced the notion of the Joint Force Authority pretty well. And as a result, because they've embraced it, I don't actually have to come down hard as hard as I thought I might have to initially. I've also been making the point that I think the term joint maybe has outlived its usefulness for us as we consider designing the future force. When we started on the journey of talking about jointness, there was a very good reason for it. We were incredibly siloed, incredibly tribal, and the term joint was quite a confronting one to many. There are still a massive number of definitions of what joint is around this place. I think it's probably easier to say what it isn't. It isn't automatically something that's tri-service, and it's certainly not doing things the way that a particular service wants them done. which has been variously, at times, that has been a view of jointery in the organisation. Nor is it the view of the service of the CDF of the day, which is another thing that's occurred from time to time, not because of the CDF, but because of the rest of the organisation. So I think joint is a bit outdated for us. I think the civilian participation from not only the rest of the department in operations, but from the rest of government means that the term has now become an inherently military term and doesn't reflect the nature of our engagement across government. So I have been using integrated, and I think that's where our direction needs to go in talking about the joint force. I'm not saying that jointery is dead, I'm just saying that the term joint at the centre of everything is maybe not as useful as it once was. And we need to talk about integration at a number of levels. We need to talk about it certainly from a technical level. We need to talk about it from an organisational level, and most importantly, I think, the cultural integration that needs to occur across the organisation. We need to ensure that integration means more than just that superficial level of connectivity between systems and platforms. It does mean that our people need to be increasingly sophisticated in the way they understand and interact across both our currently interpreted and the emerging warfighting domains. This sophistication is required because those domains are blending, and we have been forced out of our respective comfort zones. And the force design implications of that, I think, are quite significant. The three traditional domains, the air, land and sea domain, are what we know best. It's what we've trained for, it's what we've lived, most of us, and it's traditionally how we've prioritised our capital investment. You only have to sponsor a joint C4ISREW project to know that you were never really prioritised very highly. And the glue projects were always the first, well, maybe the second after infrastructure, that got the chop as we shuffled the available resources in successive white papers and force structure reviews. But we no longer can just sit in the comfort of those three domains. The increasing complexity that is brought about when you start to talk about space and cyber. There are interdependencies across all five of those domains. And I think they've set us ultimately on a path of transition. And looking forward, and the challenge to gaining superiority across these domains will increasingly rely on effective integration. This isn't just required across our own force, but it's also across government and for interoperability, obviously, with our key partners and our allies. Challenge is becoming more evident, not just because of the increased complexity, but also because we have a congested and increasingly contested operating environment. What does worry me about our operations over the last 17 or 18 years is that it hasn't been an environment where that contest has been right across the spectrum. And I think if you look at some of the things that we have now started to take for granted, particularly out of our operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, we've done all of those in an environment where air superiority has not been contested. And I think we have to guard very much against building new ways of doing things based on our recent past. because if you take UAVs, for example, how we operate UAVs, how we integrate UAVs in a contested, truly contested air environment, I think we don't actually stack up very well. I don't think anyone does, to be frank, because we've had this long period where the air environment has not effectively been contested. So we've got to watch that. I think the 5 domains is a waypoint. It's a waypoint to one domain, one single warfighting domain. I'm not saying that we won't still talk in terms of the individual domains, but as we look at force design, as we look at designing our force from the outset, we have to look at it through one warfighting domain, the lens of one warfighting domain. Now, some will say that's an esoteric, philosophical, intellectual nicety. But I actually think from a force design perspective, we actually must embrace that intellectually. Because if we're not doing that right at the outset of thinking about the force, we never will. Because our traditional structural arrangements will prevent that from taking hold if we don't address it right up front. And again, I go back to the first principles review. I think it is reshaping how we think and how we act. I think it was a really good review. We've had many reviews over the last 40 odd years, 50 years really. You go back to the time of Tang. In fact, in the first chapter, the graphic on the first chapter page in the first principles review lists all the reviews since Tang. It's a busy page, and some of them were good, some of them weren't. I think the real difference between them and the first principles review is that it was embraced by the organisation in a way that many of the others weren't. And I think the key to that was the fact that the review team actually listened to what the organisation was saying. And it didn't just listen to the top level, it listened across the organisation and down through the organisation. And I've often described the first principles review, not that the review team particularly enjoy this characterisation, but as it was a collection of all the whinges we had about this place and a sensible set of recommendations to try and address some of those. And that's why I think it's working, particularly in the capability life cycle, because it reflected some of our frustration and we've been able to do things differently with a clear mandate to do them differently. And while people were a little bit reluctant at first, they realised that they do actually have the ability to do things differently. The first two recommendations, one was about the establishment of a strong strategic centre to strengthen accountability and top-level decision-making. And the second, and for me, crucial one, was the establishment of a single end-to-end capability development function within the department to maximise the delivery of military capability. And the CLC is the heart of the FPR from my perspective, and I'm not just saying that because I was the stream lead for it. If the CLC redesign failed, in my mind, the first principles review failed with it. And I don't think it has failed. I have been able to play a much more active role as a result of the enhanced decision-making rights that I've been given as a result of first principles review, both from a joint force authority perspective, but also as chair of the investment committee, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But importantly, having the force design division under Mel Hupfeld and the force integration division under Peter Quinn, has really been able to give me the advice so that I can exercise those critical force authority functions. I think the force design process that we have developed, while it's still, I think we've got to be fair and say that it's still a nascent process. It's still evolving, but it's starting to give us some of the things that we wanted to see. And the first thing it's given us is a rolling force structure review mentality. As anyone who has been involved in a force structure review would know, it's a frenetic year or so of your life that you never get back. It does enhance life experience considerably. You learn a lot of lessons in a force structure review, but it's not really the way to design a force as complex as ours by just looking at it every 4 or 5 years in a short burst of feverish activity with a small team focused on it. The force design process now looks at this on an ongoing basis, essentially in a 4-year cycle. And while it is very much centre-driven, strong strategic centre-driven, it absolutely relies on the input right across the organisation, and particularly the expertise that the capability managers and their staff bring to it. Another key part of that process is contestability. There was a lot of concern initially around the establishment of the contestability function. A lot of it was based on mythology. There was no doubt that the old FDA division, and there's a couple of people here that spent time in that division, could be a prickly, obstinate, adversarial, but they would maintain value-adding part of the organisation. It was difficult. And one of the things that we were very worried about was in creating a new contestability function, that it not be adversarial, that it be constructive. And we put a lot of effort in early on to making sure that we got the right culture in contestability. And I think Michael Shoebridge has done a fantastic job in taking that forward and maintaining the right cultural approach to contestability. It's not only the contestability team that's done the right thing, it's the rest of the organisation in embracing it as something that you would want to have. Why would you not want your ideas and your proposals appropriately contested and improved? Because that is at the end of the day what we're trying to do. We're trying to get the best proposal and the best options to go to government. And I think we've seen very strong evidence that that is working and working well. I do worry about the introduction and fairly rapid introduction of a number of 5th generation capabilities. I think one of the risks we have is that we will, for a considerable period of time, if we're not careful, underemploy those capabilities because we simply don't understand what's involved in feeding them. And one of our key workforce challenges is making sure that we have an appropriately skilled workforce that can feed the 5th generation beast, because it is an information-hungry set of capabilities. And we're working pretty hard on that, but it does remain something that we're all focused on in terms of risks. The other challenge for us is the notion of Who are we integrating with? What are we trying to integrate? So our whole Defence of Australia mindset is the ADF fighting on its own, as it should be able to do to defend the country. That requires a very high level of what I would call horizontal integration across the force. But we spend 99.9% of our time not operating as an integrated ADF, but operating in components. Not our own components, but in coalition components, and invariably in US components or US-led components. And there are many parts of the ADF that are better integrated and more interoperable with parts of the appropriate US force than the rest of the ADF. Now, is that a problem? Maybe, maybe not. What it sets up is a very interesting challenge in terms of our capital investment program, and where do we invest, particularly in the C4ISREW space. Where do we invest? Do we invest for the horizontal integration, or do we invest for that vertical integration up the component silo? The answer, of course, is always we have to do both, but it's about getting the balance right in the investment settings that I think is actually one of the more challenging pieces of work when you try and look across the entire portfolio. We are going to have to work at that consistently. I think it's good that we can have these gatherings, and I'm very hopeful that this will become an annual part of the process, because it will be through getting those external and different views that we continue to make progress. We know we don't have all the answers internally. We don't pretend that we do, but we do value academia, we value think tanks, we value industry's input into this pretty challenging scenario. I want to talk a little bit about the investment committee, because it is actually a key part of the capability life cycle when it comes to decision making. One of the things that we did as a result of the first principles review recommendation was to bring on external representation into the investment committee with the Department of Finance. Now, again, a bit like the contestability discussion, there was, I think, abject horror at that suggestion across the organisation when it first came out. Within 3 or 4 months, I think we had realised just how powerful it was, and we then offered Prime Minister and Cabinet the opportunity to join in, because I think what they saw was a growing alignment between finance and defence, which would really concern P&C. Alan McKinnon came onto the committee, as well as Rosemary Huxtable, who was then the DepSec at Finance. And it's really important that it was at that level, that senior level, because of the understanding they gained from seeing how we worked, and then, of course, their ability to propagate that back through their own agencies and departments. I think it's been the single biggest positive thing that we've done in terms of the investment committee. It has fundamentally changed the dynamic between central agencies and defence in the last couple of years. Fundamentally changed the dynamic. And many of you will know that Lindsay Tanner is a member of the Oversight Board from the First Principles Review, and I think it still causes him great consternation when I speak so glowingly about finance. As a former finance minister in a different era, you know, I think he finds this a very interesting concept, and he's very supportive. But I think at first he was wondering how this was going to work. We have a fantastic relationship now with central agencies on our key capability proposals. I would happily talk about it all day, because it was something that people were concerned about, basically showing the inner workings of the place to others, when in fact it was exactly what we needed. First of all, I think central agencies have a far greater respect for the amount of work that we do collectively in the preparation of our proposals. They understand that the stereotype image of defence is this big spending department that really does what it wants to do, and this government thing is just something off to the side that gets in the way occasionally, and seeing that that's actually not how we view things and not how we operate has been very powerful. And we now have incredibly supportive advocates for what we're doing across the force design process, but across the capability life cycle more generally. So it's been an absolutely watershed decision, and it certainly helped us achieve last year, I think it was over 72 or 73 approvals through NSC, which we've never done before, nowhere near it. And we certainly couldn't have done it if we still had that relatively adversarial approach that we traditionally had with central agencies. The other important part of the investment committee, and I always have to be careful how I put this, is that the CDF and the secretary are not on it. Dennis used to get a little bit irritated when I said this, but it again changes the dynamic. It's a committee of peers who, frankly, are all engaged and are rolling up their sleeves and getting on with the job of delivering the IIP to government. Again, it's more of a dynamics thing that has been the change. There's no posturing, it's just getting on with it. And the levels of collaboration, I think those who sit around the back of the room would attest to very, very high levels of genuine collaboration and very low levels of tribalism when we're talking about particular issues. And it's not like we've just had a positive financial trajectory. We've had a couple of issues which has required us to reprioritise the IIP, and the traditional sorts of fights and altercations simply weren't there. It was an acceptance that we just need to get on with it and deliver the program. Because of the ambitious nature of the IIP and the sheer number of proposals that are going through, I think it is causing a degree of cabinet submission writing stress across the organisation. We had gone through a phase where we contracted the cab sub writing skill set to a relatively small group of people, and we'd done a lot of work in making them much more intelligible and digestible for busy ministers. But we've actually had to now broaden that out purely from a capacity issue. And that's going to have some very good benefits across the organisation as people get back into the habit of writing submissions for government. In most other departments, it's a line area responsibility, and it's just that we have a lot of them to do. And over time, I think we'll see a significant improvement as we go forward. The other key change, well, a couple of key changes we've made in terms of our relationship with NSC is moving away from a strict financial threshold decision-making process to decide what goes to NSC and what doesn't. It used to be very clear if it was over $100 million, it went to the NSC. So it could be a $200 million worth of plumbing, electrical rewiring and sewage treatment at a base, but yet that took up NSC airtime. Highly transactional, not very strategic, and I don't think anyone thought that that was a terrific idea. What we have done is adopted the smart buyer risk process, which we use in developing our proposals. We run workshops with central agencies to determine what we all consider to be the risk level for that project, and then that then decides whether it goes to NSC or 2 ministers or 1 minister. That is going to be a very significant bandwidth reduction issue for the NSC, and will allow them to take to get out of some of the transactional stuff and much more into the strategic piece. Aligned with that is we've used the 6 streams that were in the white paper to describe the force structure, and we are now moving towards stream submissions to NSC once a year. 6 submissions, each of the 6 streams once a year. And what we're trying to do in that is to give them in 6 blobs, if you like, a much bigger piece of the force structure to look at so they can see those interdependencies and think through the relationship between some of those individual projects within the streams. I think that will be, again, another way of reducing the traffic that flows through and explains why things are going to ministers rather than to the NSC. What we're doing is preparing a plan, and each year we present to the NSC and say, this is the forward work program for the next couple of years. This is what we think you should look at. This is what we think 2 ministers should do. This is what we think 1 minister should do. And they, of course, have the right to say, no, we want to see that, we want to see that, or we don't want to see that. And again, very positive response from the NSC members, because it allows a different type of conversation to occur, a more strategic and holistic discussion of the force structure and the whole force design piece. So that, in a nutshell, is the investment committee. We have long meetings, 6, 7 hours. Some people think that's ridiculous, but if you look at the size of the program, and remembering that this is not like the old Capability and Investment Committee, which really only looked at the old DCP projects. This looks at all the major capability projects, infrastructure projects and ICT, both operational ICT and enterprise ICT. So it's a very big, in fact, I think it is probably the biggest capital investment program in the country now when you add all that together. And we are still learning the tricks of the trade of looking at this from a portfolio perspective. But I think we are seeing connections that we didn't, as a top table, see before. We're having discussions on topics that are not just related to individual proposals, but things like enterprise bandwidth, for example. What is the future direction of our bandwidth requirements? Which, if you stick to project by project discussions, you'll never have that discussion because you only look at the problem through the lens of a single project. I think lifting it up, grouping things up together, ultimately into streams, is a much more sensible way of looking at the problem and generates a different sort of conversation, which is really important because we're now attacking issues which in some cases have been just untouched, and we're now grappling with some of the difficult challenges around that. I might stop there. I think I need to move to my next gig, but thanks very much, and I'll be back tomorrow afternoon, I think, to close off, and I hope the rest of the time goes well. Thank you.